Previously an interpreted archaeological survey of Dodleston Castle in Cheshire, shown here, undertaken by the University of Chester in 1995, prompted a detailed and multidisciplinary study as part of my ongoing research on the castles of Cheshire and their landscape settings within the context of the Irish Sea region. But what can the earthwork remains of an Anglo-Norman castle site tell us about the northern Anglo-Welsh border prior to the Anglo-Normans' arrival in Cheshire in about 1070? My conclusions, partially published and shortly forthcoming in full, called for a revised classification of the long-held one, which was that there was a regular form of Motte and Bailey Castle at Cheshire. Closer examination reveals instead that Doddleston Castle was in fact a ringwork castle, placed within a pre-existing rectilinear feature sometime later. And later again, a motte was inserted into the ringwork castle. What is more, this multifaceted complex is situated within a much larger ringwork, not shown here and certainly not recognised previously. And this interpretation, this new interpretation, indicates that Doddleston Castle assumed a place of prior cross-cultural, secular, ritual and religious significance within this northern border of the medieval Anglo-Welsh territory. Forming part of the wider landscape of the Irish Sea region, archaeological landscape and certainly less secure place name evidence at Doddleston Castle points to a reused place of significance over time. And this reuse, I argue, perpetuated a memory of communication in an early medieval Welsh borderlands landscape where the confluence of people and ideas was common. Doddleston Castle, shown here in the blue square, was situated within the powerful border earldom of medieval Cheshire, and you can see the western half of the county here, with the county's capital at the borough of Chester, shown here in the blue circle. This position gave Doddleston strategic importance, as well as vital control and valuable exploitation of a wide economic territory. Doddleston Castle formed a significant link in parallel defensive chains of fortifications, or beads on a string as they have been called, focused on the River Dee Valley and the Watling Street leading to Roman Watling Street leading to Chester. These defensive strings of beads of castles intended to protect Chester from attacks from the west, from the Welsh, and they also, I suggest, had the time-honoured purpose of overseeing north to south routeway, riverine and maritime movement of people and trade. Although the west boundary of medieval Cheshire was fluid over time, these castles were situated within the semi-detached 10th century founded administrative unit of Attis Cross Hundred in West Cheshire, as delineated by Great Domesday Book during the late Mercian and early Anglo-Norman periods. Cheshire extended into what is now northeast Wales up to the River Conwy. In a recent article, I proposed that Chester to the west of the River Dee was for millennia an area of movement and trade via the centrally important ports of Chester and Mells to the rest of the Irish Sea region. What is more, the Anglo-Norman castles to the west of the River Dee and to the east of three Mercian linear earthwork dikes of Whitford, Watts and Offers, notably and unusually take one of two forms: mottes without any evidence of bailies, of which there are 9 shown here in red, and mottes with rectilinear shaped rather than more usual kidney shaped bailies, of which there are 13 shown here in blue. I argue that these forms represent periodic reuse of monuments for the same surveillance purposes of this border territory since the Iron Age, and that this in itself indicates that the beginnings of the medieval march of borderlands likely originated in the Iron Age, at least notionally, if not physically. Doddlestone Castle then appears to take the modern rectilinear bailey form within this borderland. So what do we know about the history and location of Doddlestone Castle? Well, I'll have to be necessarily brief here, although there is actually very little. The place name, Doddlestone, first appears as Doddlestone, so without the L, in the Great Domesday Book survey of about 1086, and is of Old English derivation. Doddlestone likely meant Doddle's farm, but I wonder if the scribe might have misspelt Doddlestone, and it was in fact originally derived from the elements Doda, a personal name found in Domesday Book, and Stan, where Stan means stone in Old English. I'll come back to this later, but this is something I shall never be able to prove, and so I must put these musings down to my fanciful thinking for now. Doddlestone Manor, although not a castle, not the castle, was recorded as being within Attiscross 100 in Cheshire at the time of the Domesday survey, that bit of semi-detached Cheshire where all the unusually shaped castles are sited. And I'll come back to this bit about Doddlestone Manor being recorded in Attiscross 100 in Domesday later too. The castle was positioned adjacent to Pulford Brook, a tributary of the River Dee, and Pulford Castle was positioned to its south. Both Doddlestone and Pulford Castles, shown in the blue with the blue circles here, served to protect the Pulford Pass, which is shown here as Passus in Latin, between them, which gave access across the marshlands from Cheshire to the Welsh borderlands proper via the Roft Castle, shown to the bottom left of the slide, which I shall also mention again briefly later. In 1086, in Domesday Book, the manor of Doddlestone was held directly by the Mercian Earl Edwin, and so presumably carried some considerable importance in West Cheshire. By 1086, in Domesday Book, Doddlestone was the caput or head manor of the largely dispersed holdings of the Anglo-Norman Osborne Fitz-Tezo, who was important enough to have had 15 burgesses in Chester Borough. At some time during the mid-12th century, Doddlestone was held by the Boydell family, first by Helder de Boydell, whom the Cheshire antiquarian Ormerod claims to have been a direct descendant of Osborne Fitz-Tezo, although this cannot be confirmed. And neither is there any documentary evidence to support the fact that Doddlestone Castle was in existence prior to 1277. Implicit documentary evidence during the 12th and 13th centuries, however, indicates that the castle was in existence by the end of the 12th century at the latest. Additionally, in 1401, King Henry IV called upon the castles in the Welsh March, including Doddlestone, to prepare for action against the Prince of Wales, Owain Glyndŵr. This is a record of devastation west of the River Dee following the Welsh risings in August 1403, when Doddlestone was reportedly destroyed. In respect of its strategic position within the Welsh borderlands, therefore, Doddlestone was clearly pivotal from the 12th century at the latest. Given that existing historical evidence for Doddlestone Castle is somewhat limited, what can other evidence tell us about its foundation, form and position within this Anglo-Welsh borderlands landscape? Following close study of both the 1995 archaeological survey and my site visits, it is notable that the earthworks within which Doddlestone Castle are sited form a further larger ring, shown here on the 1960s Ordnance survey map. Additionally, two fields encircling the castle earthworks are named the Ring on the 19th century tithe map and apportionment, which I've highlighted here in red. What seems to be a concentric outer ring of closes has since been built over to a great extent, although respected by the curve of the by-road today. That field, called the Ring, to the west of the castle site is now the site of houses. and the church of St. Mary's is encapsulated to the east. The surrounding road probably once circled the whole of the ringwork, indicated by the presence of a holloway to the east of St. Mary's Church, now a footpath, which is marked here in red, which runs towards the southeast of the castle site. The ring at Doddlestone is a new observation and could represent any one or indeed all of three features in this Welsh borderlands landscape, and these I'll consider briefly in turn. Firstly, fields called ring in the neighbouring county, Lancashire, for instance, possibly refer to prehistoric circular enclosures, especially to stone circles. And this field name is not unique in Cheshire. Also within Attiscross 100, parallels could be drawn with Mynach Gwyvan, Welsh for the stone in the field of Gwyvan, that is the Irish St. Kevin, which demonstrates the influence of the Irish Sea region in this northern Anglo-Welsh North Border territory. The stone is an in situ Anglo-Scandinavian carved stone on the boundary of church lands, set within a circular enclosure amidst Bronze Age barrows, then marked here 1 to 6 in grey. Contextual evidence for a ritual landscape in the liminal area of Doddlestone supports this theory of an earlier enclosure. For instance, Gorstella, ringed in red here, a hamlet within Doddlestone, means a mound at Gorse Hill, and in 1240 there is documentary evidence of a Hoga de Kinnerton, the Mound of Kinnerton, which is off this map to the west of Gorstella, and which is also within Doddlestone parish and would have been on the tidal estuary of the River Dee at this date. Doddlestone, by comparison, is missing a carved stone, despite my fanciful musings on the place name origin I made earlier. Secondly, the ring at Doddlestone could refer to an early British, that is Welsh, curvilinear site, a churchyard site. The curvilinear nature of the ring, which sits on the ridge of compact clay to the west of River Dee, indicates a probable pre-Anglo-Norman religious use of the site, with what has been likened to a Welsh or British Llan-type church siting, an enclosure in early medieval Wales and indeed Ireland, for a churchyard, church or monastery, but the word Llan could also be used to describe an enclosed cemetery, not necessarily associated with a church structure. Thirdly, it may well be that Doddlestone, indicated with the blue dot on the slide there, had been an Anglo-Saxon assembly site. The majority of 10th century dated administrative units of hundreds, which are shown here, are named after the assembly sites in Cheshire, and Domesday Book is testament to this. Doddlestone, however, is recorded in Domesday Book as being in Attiscross 100, which is indicated by the 1A and 1B there, rather than the not dissimilarly named Doddlestone 100, as we know. It could be that Doddlestone was the Mercian Earls assembly site for Doddlestone 100 at the likely 10th century introduction of the 100 or territorial units to the west of Cheshire. It is possible that Doddlestone was divorced from the rest of Doddlestone 100, and this happened when King Harold granted Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, King of Gwynedd, all of Cheshire west of the River Dee in 1055-6. As described in Domesday Book. This land had in all likelihood belonged previously to Powys in Wales before it was seized by the Mercians and held by the Bishop of Lichfield. Therefore, despite Cheshire later claiming back these lands from Gruffydd in 1063, the earlier transfer of Doddlestone to Gruffydd's Attiscross 100 was still evident and unchanged in Domesday Book's depiction of 1086. Doddlestone appears to have lost its $100 identity about 15 years or so beforehand as a result of this border fluctuation. There is no single archaeological signature for an Anglo-Saxon assembly site, although Meany describes three categories of Anglo-Saxon 100 places. The first category is a natural meeting place, which includes fords, crossroads, and gaps for crossing ditches or dikes and bridges. All these features are present within Doddlestone's immediate landscape, as I've already outlined. The second category, according to Meany, was for assembly places at naturally occurring landmarks, which included stones, possibly like the one at Mynachwevan we saw earlier. Notably, Doddlestone 100 means dud or duda and stan, meaning stone. Perhaps Doddleston had had a standing stone within the ring at the time. We may never know. The third category of Anglo-Saxon assembly site is man-made structures such as barrows, where similarities between 100-year meeting places and pagan shrines existed, both in terms of location and their features. And I've already mentioned Dodleston within its prehistoric landscape context of mounds. Indeed, Doddlestone has a number of features of an assembly site: natural accessibility, liminality to territorial units, these being Chester itself, Wilverstone, Exerston, Doddlestone and Attiscross hundreds, notably all within the Diocese of Lichfield in 1086. And Doddlestone also has visibility and views. As a crucial place of judicial, commercial and elite power in this borderland landscape, the location of Doddlestone as a potential Anglo-Saxon assembly place just inside major territorial boundaries indicates that it may also have been a regional and provincial within the Irish Sea region participant, rather than purely a local one. Therefore, given the contextual, archaeological and wider landscape evidence, it is possible that the ring dictated the form of the later Anglo-Norman castle. I suggest that Doddlestone, shown here as a LiDAR image, was initially a ringwork castle built within the earlier outer earthworks of the ring feature. Doddlestone's initial ringwork castle form makes it unique within both West Cheshire and now what is northeast Wales, with the notable exception of the Mercian and later Anglo-Norman Earl's Head Manor at Harden, also situated to the west of the River Dee in the Anglo-Welsh borderlands area. Both Anglo-Norman castles were probably built within or upon prehistoric ringwork sites of significance. While the conversion of ringwork to Motte and Bailey Castle was not unusual in England, the question now arises as to why Doddlestone Castle's so-called Bailey was rectilinear. The later added raised corners of the sub-rectangle clearly protrude into the ditch of the ring, indicating that the rectilinear build postdates the ring, seen here, so narrowing the ditch and weakening its defensibility, particularly to the west. This so-called unusual Bailey appears to be unique within Cheshire to the east of the River Dee, although the form is concentrated in number to the west of the River Dee in the Welsh borderlands, as I've already shown. It therefore seemed logical to not only look to England, but also to Wales for any comparison. In this respect, there is a further historical and archaeological argument for pushing the existence of a castle at Doddlestone back to the first mention of 1277 to at least the 1140s, when we consider the influence on the medieval county of Cheshire from Madoc ap Meredith, who died in 1160, who was King of Powys. Very briefly, from 1140s, Madoc had made peace with both King Henry II and Ranulph II de Gurnon, 4th Earl of Chester. And this relationship probably ensured that Madoc retained the lands he had gained in the Cheshire hundreds of Attiscross and Exerston on behalf of Powys, both situated to the west of the River Dee. The Middle Welsh prose tale, The Dream of Ranabui, was written as late as the 14th century, and it is generally accepted that the Doddlestone, that is, it's spelled D-U rather than D-O, which is mentioned within the tale of which Madoc is described as being undisputed lord, was the Doddlestone in the detached northern part of Oswestry in Shropshire. There is a strong and long-held case for this interpretation, an alternative location not having appeared to have been discussed beyond a fleeting isolated mention to date. There is an obvious difference in the transcribed spelling of Doddlestone in the Dream of Ranabui and Doddlestone in Cheshire, But it is notable that Dodleston in Cheshire was spelled Doddlestone in the mid-14th century, when the prose tale was thought to have been written. This is not evidence enough to make Cheshire worthy of consideration as Madog's fabled seat of power in the east of his then recently acquired and extended Parisian territory, as say Cheshire, Dodleston in Cheshire, of course, which included the castles of Erddig in Wrexham, Bromfield, also known as the Roft, and Overton. However, the contemporary 12th century poet Gwalchmai ab Maelor describes Madog as holding powers to the gates of Chester, which firmly placed Dodleston in Cheshire within Madog's newly gained territory. However, I might try to make place name evidence fit any theories. While this argument for a Welsh influence on the form of Doddleston Castle in Cheshire is based on circumstantial, implicit, and arguably poetically licensed historical evidence, there is nevertheless a strong case for it, where archaeological evidence strengthens this possibility. Beyond my own work, there does not appear to be any other study on rectilinear baileys in general, although it has been suggested that some rectilinear earthworks in Wales should be seen as royal centres of the later Anglo-Saxon period, which mimicked Mercian burhs. In fact, such rectilinear earthworks could be Roman, Welsh, Slesoith, and/or Mercian burhs. Could it be significant, however, that the earthworks of Madog's royal seat at Mathrathel, shown here 10 kilometres west of Welshpool in Powys, can be associated with an oval ditched enclosure, later disused and superseded by a subrectangular closure in about 1200. This was probably built to create a Welsh manorial or llys or Welsh palace site after the levelling of the earlier bailey defences. Mathraffel's subrectangular bailey is approximately 100 metres square, compared to Doddlestone's of approximately 125. And on the east edge for both, a motte of approximately the same height. It is notable that Mathraffel's proximity to the Church of Myford, also dedicated to St. Mary, as is Doddlestone's, is described as almost certainly an early foundation. The church contains a cross slab datable to the late 9th or 10th century. Madog was the last king of Powys to have been buried there. In this paper, I have proposed the new classification and so a new interpretation for the initial build of Dodleston Castle in Cheshire. It is as a ringwork castle, probably built within an early medieval founded assembly site within Doddlestone Hundred. We lost the 11th century hundred or meeting place of Doddlestone, I argue, because of political shifts of territory in the landscape prior to the arrival of the Anglo-Normans in about 1070. Doddleston therefore assumed a place of continued cross-cultural, secular, ritual and religious significance within a fluctuating borderland territory, evidenced in the palimpsest of earthworks today. I've also noted that the castle's subrectangular bailey is similar to the castle earthworks along the northern Anglo-Welsh border, which likely reused sites of former significance and memory within a cultural zone of movement of trade centred on the River Dee, Chester and the Irish Sea region. Archaeological and landscape evidence at Doddleston Castle is undoubtedly a testament to a marriage of cultures and shifting borders in the early medieval northern Anglo-Welsh borderlands, east of the three Mercian dykes of Wickford, Watts and Offers. The shift in interpretation presented here indicates the value, I believe, of ongoing interdisciplinary and cross-period research, raising many interesting avenues of inquiry along the entire context of the early medieval Anglo-Welsh border. Thank you.